So thank you all for coming. I do just want to point out that today I'm actually on strike. But I'm giving this talk in the spirit of upholding feminist and gender principles of equality. We've discussed that, and that's actually also part of the aims of the strike, which is about addressing the gender pay gap in higher education. Okay, so my presence here is not a signal that I'm not in support of the strike. I just wanted to point that out. Okay, so my talk, I'm going to sit down, although I do like to stand, but I'm a little bit too heavy. So this talk, as Konstantina said, it's called Malian Women and Their Motives for Trading, Subsistence, Gender Complementarity and Individualism. And it's based on a chapter from my PhD thesis, which I completed in anthropology at SOAS very recently. So during the whole of 2013, I basically conducted anthropological fieldwork in Dakar, which is the capital of Senegal in West Africa, amongst female traders who originated from Mali, so the neighboring country. Okay, so Malian women in Dakar. And these women came primarily from Mali's southern and western regions, and just as the majority of Mali's population, they were speakers of a Mande language and they were Muslim. Okay, so I'll be referring to this sometimes, the fact that they were Muslim, but also the fact that they were sort of the Mande population. So just thought I'd talk a little bit about feminist research in West Africa, just to sort of set the conceptual frame. So research on women in West Africa has tended to emphasize the complementarity of the genders and a communitarian ethic, where women in particular are associated with cooperation and social harmony. And Barbara Hoffman has also argued that, in fact, what is at work in Mande society is actually mythical male dominance. So men demonstrate dominating behaviors against women, and women act as if males were the dominant sex, but women nevertheless hold certain kinds of social and economic power and even political authority. Some African feminists, as you probably know, have lamented the sort of more Eurocentric kind of battle of the sexes, and perhaps an obsession with women's issues and women's liberation, when in fact these African feminists point out a concern with gender should also include a focus on men and masculinities and more general social issues. And in this context, I can quote Sirat Diop, who has been the president for over 20 years of the Malian National Union of Women in Mali, and who stated that we're not demanding equal rights with men. All we want is more rights and some free time. So clearly these scholars are raising some very important points by particularly pointing out that West Africans are not necessarily ontological individualists. So meaning that they consider the genders as complementary and interdependent, and identities and experiences as socially embedded. And secondly, that these societies are not patriarchal in the Western sense, in that traditionally West African women do have domains of power, especially in the domestic arena, and women therefore consider themselves complementary and not subordinate to men. Okay. So this is in fact similar to the experiences of women in many other non-Western societies, and this was something Naila Kabir argued in her lecture here last year that I attended, the Phyllis Kebery commemorative lecture that she gave here. So she pointed out that as a result of this, these experiences that women have in non-Western societies, many of the practices that feminists have identified as manifestations of patriarchal control are actively embraced by these women. Okay. So in this talk, I'm going to examine the motives of women traders and how these women's social and financial autonomy corresponded with prevailing gender frameworks. And I examine both how the women sought to justify their trading activities morally and ideologically, but also how they contested prevailing gender ideologies by engaging in trade. So the analysis examines how women in practice reproduced or challenged dominant gender ideologies. So I focus, of course, on practice and base it on my observations as an anthropologist. So to go back to Naila Kabir, because I found this talk very inspiring actually. So when examining gender relations in so-called communitarian societies, Naila Kabir emphasizes the analytical importance of looking out for competing gender discourses, which enable people to reflect on and object to the status quo, because they can compare their situation with alternative possibilities. So Kabir emphasizes that Muslim societies are not internally homogeneous, and that different pathways to personhood can coexist within them. And this is, of course, also applicable in the Senegalese context. So as we all know, societies change, and traditional arrangements and dominant ideological models derived, for example, from Islam or from Manda mythology, do not necessarily reflect the contemporary lived experiences of West African women. And this also relates to Kabir's point that identity is not predetermined and fixed by cultural norms, but is shifting and fluid in constant process of construction and reconstruction through the social interactions of everyday life. So this is very pertinent to my analysis of these Malian traders. I mean, my female informants' narratives about why they traded were often incoherent and even at odds with their own behavior. So this suggests that different and sometimes contradictory ideological models were frequently at play simultaneously. And most strikingly, really, this question of whether a married woman should stay at home and be provided for by her husband, or whether all women had a moral duty to financially support their families, particularly under conditions of poverty, appeared to be an unresolved moral and ideological conundrum. And it might be worth pointing out that Senegal is a very poor country, and Mali is in fact one of the poorest countries in the world. It's been consistently ranked as the 4th poorest country in the world. So there's just not that much money going around. But let me start by explaining some of the empirical context and the profile of my informants. And I've got a table there where you can basically see the occupation, marital status, and the age of my main informants. I spoke to so many people during my fieldwork, but these were women that I kept sort of having conversations with throughout that whole year. So I thought it was, it's not a representative sample or anything, but it's just to give you an idea of who these traders were and who I spoke to. And you'll see that some of the places says Banabana. So Banabana is basically one of these traders that travels constantly back and forth between Mali and Senegal with goods. And the rest of the traders that have not been denoted as Banabanas, they were living permanently in Dakar, and they were trading from a Malian market, so they had a stall or a shop in the market, so they were living there the whole time. So most of my informants were women in their 30s, 40s and 50s, as you can see out there. And they were basically all financially in charge of their own households, even if they were married. So this reflects a wider tendency in Mali and also in the rest of the continent, where the lack of economic opportunities has meant that men are increasingly unable to live up to the masculine ideal of establishing independent households and providing for their families. So generalized unemployment and lack of permanent jobs keep men dependent on their families and in a prolonged state of youth, as several studies have pointed out from all over the continent. So marital projects are difficult to realize, and this entails a prolonging of celibacy. And this, of course, also has implications for women who may struggle to establish but also to maintain conjugal relations with men. So African women have become increasingly involved in long-distance migration and in trade since the 1990s. And they also participate more actively in the capitalist economy and contribute more to household budgets and they're increasingly educated. So as a result of this, marriage is often postponed and conjugal unions are less stable than before. So it's really something that's changing both for men and for women. And as you can see here, about half of the female traders that I interviewed during my field work were single women who were either divorced or widowed and who had remained unmarried. And generally in Senegal and Mali, it's not very well considered for a woman, especially in her reproductive age, to be unmarried, to be single. And divorce, I mean, it's not very common in Mali. It's increasing in Mali. In Dakar, it's a bit more common, you might say, but it's not very well considered. And then in terms of the married female traders that I worked with, their husbands were generally unable to provide for them and their children, usually because their income was irregular and insufficient. So a number of my informants were married to what Chantal Rondeau has called a mari de passage. This is obviously in French because this is French-speaking Africa. But a mari de passage is like a transit husband, you might translate this as. So that's largely absent husbands who were residing in another country. And you can see the ones that are married there had husbands in Ivory Coast, in France, Burkina Faso, and in Mali. So effectively, they were single because they were actually living on their own. And during the husband's absence, many of these women were expected to provide for themselves and their children, and only some husbands transferred remittances to pay for bills and for other major expenses. Okay, so that was just a bit of background to who these women I'm talking about are. So let's move on to the actual analysis of their motives. And in this analysis, I've sort of crudely divided the motives into three distinct parts that consider trade in relation to subsistence, complementarity, and individualism. And this is really just done for heuristic purposes. It's not to deny that in fact, these aspects were of course overlapping. And that the women's motives were, of course, complex and also changing. So the analysis that I'm going to present really revolve around tensions between the individual and the collective in a changing society. So the first part is going to focus on subsistence and consider some of the moral compromises that the women made in order to be able to trade. The second part queries this notion of the complementarity of the genders that I discussed in the beginning. And it shows how women sought to defend their rights to engage in trade and to freely dispose of their own income in the face of certain needs and demands by men. And then the final third part deals with women who operated in a socially and financially autonomous fashion and examines how this then affected social relations. So I'll start with the subsistence question. So many of the women that I met in Dakar were trading out of financial necessity. There's no point in denying that. But so they were trading in order to support themselves and their families. And only a small minority of the female traders that I met were both married and financially provided for by their husbands. And the notion that these women had any free choice in their decision to trade was, or that they derived any enjoyment from it, tended to be downplayed by certain informants, including some of the women traders themselves, but also some of the older Malian men that I interviewed and who knew of these women. So basically I was told women did not trade because they liked it, but because they had no husband who could provide for them. And I've got a quote there by one established female market trader saying, "The Malian women are tired and sont fatiguées. They're tired in their marriages and tired in trade." So tired in French you would say fatigué, and this word fatigue, fatigué, just cropped up several times in my conversations with these women. And to the point where I started to find this word quite intriguing and thought I need to understand what is so central about this notion of la fatigue. So fatigue meaning tiredness, exhaustion, fatigue, as you know. So I won't deny these traders' real experiences of exhaustion, but of course I did wonder why the women so frequently felt that they needed to point this out. And one sort of explanation, I thought, well, emphasizing their fatigue might have been an indirect expression of pride by the female traders in the hard work that they were carrying out. So this suggests a kind of work ethic that celebrates the hardships of labor. And indeed, hard work was valued by both genders and was not as such definitive of either masculinity or femininity. It's not as if it's only men who do hard work. Women very much sort of identified with this notion of doing hard work and being proud of doing hard work. So that was kind of one dimension. Sometimes the usage of the term fatigue resembled the way that Westerners may use the term stress to stand in for uncertainty and fear. And in this case, the fatigue that informants experience would often manifest as headaches. And there was very high levels of consumption of paracetamol and other painkillers to cure la fatigue, and I was often asked if I had any medication against la fatigue when I talked to these women. So one female trader interestingly told me it's very dangerous if women have headaches. With women it's their stomach that aches, but if a woman has a headache it's really not good. So in this sense the mental stress and its accompanying headaches were construed as something that only men should endure. And complaining about la fatigue might therefore have been a way for a trade woman to indirectly criticize her own involvement in this masculine type of work, and to bemoan the wider socioeconomic situation that forced her to perform this work, which meant that she had to step outside of her ideal gender role. So the lack of a capable male breadwinner clearly created a financial necessity for the women to engage in trade. But for some of my informants, women's involvement in trade was also a potential moral problem, because according to them, a woman should marry and stay at home and be provided for by her husband. And for some of my informants, if a married woman traded at the market, it suggested that she was potentially neglecting her role as a wife and a mother, which would reflect negatively on her husband. And this is different from Ghana, for example, where Gracia Clark has pointed out that in fact trading is an essential part of what it means to be a woman and a wife and a mother, and it shows that you're caring and so on. That's quite a different kind of connotation from Malian and Senegal, I would say. So this idea about female traders potentially neglecting their roles as a wife and a mother may explain why a dominant discourse on female traders emphasized these women's lack of choice in the decision to trade, and people insisting that these women traded out of pure necessity and not out of their own free will. But nonetheless, I often sensed that there was much more to the women's trade than a mere pursuit of the means to pay for their family's subsistence needs. So although poverty was sometimes the main reason, or at least part of the explanation why they had entered the trading profession, it wasn't necessarily the only motivating factor. So other aspects like women's personal enjoyment, learning and independence that they derived from trading were largely suppressed in this prevailing sort of victimhood discourse. So this kind of what I call the victimhood discourse maintained an ideology of female domesticity and male dominance by implying that the women who traded were not deliberately pursuing this occupation, and that ideally they would prefer to be staying at home and be provided for by a husband. So framed in this way, female trade did not necessarily undermine the status or perceived dominance of men. So it could be argued that the Malian women who were trading accepted this victimhood discourse in order to uphold this myth of male dominance that I mentioned in the beginning. So the semblance of men being in power. So to understand the women's rationale for espousing this victimhood discourse, it helps to consider women's acceptance of the discourse as a way of bargaining with patriarchy, and I'm of course here referring to Candiotti's famous study on bargaining with patriarchy. So by portraying themselves as tired, as fatigué, as suffering, the women downplayed their own agency in the decision to become, but also to remain traders, of course. So this victimhood discourse socially legitimized the women's trading activities because the women were not seen to challenge or subvert the dominant gender ideology. And in this sense, the victimhood discourse could be considered as a form of patriarchal bargaining, which allowed the women to go about their trade without jeopardizing their status or social relationships. Yeah. And I knew of several Malian men in Dakar who preferred that their wives stayed at home instead of going out to work. And this could be based on religious grounds, so this idea that being a good Muslim for some men meant taking full charge of their families, including taking charge of their wives. But prestige also appeared to play a role in this notion, since being able to afford to have one's wife stay at home implied that you were self-sufficiently wealthy, even if in practice many men struggled to make ends meet on their own. And I frequently observed this distressing discrepancy that men experience between the masculine ideals and then the reality of poverty. And this came out in a conversation that I had with Yaya, who was an assistant to one of the female traders trading cloth from Mali. So he was working for this woman and he was married. And he told me that he wanted to become a Wahhabiyya. So Wahhabiyya is not exactly referring to the sort of Salafist type of Islam that we hear about in the media from Saudi Arabia. I mean, amongst the Malians in Dakar, Wahhabiyya referred to a non-violent reformist type of Islam, emphasizing correct Muslim practice. I'm happy to discuss that further. But basically, Yahya then explained to me that he found it really difficult to be a true Wahhabiyya. So I'll quote him. He said, "Once I have a lot of money, I'll be a good Muslim. I'll be 100% Wahhabiyya. But if you don't have money, it's hard to be a good Muslim. To be Wahhabiyya, you need lots of money to afford to keep a woman in the house." And he sort of turned an imaginary key. But we in Senegal are poor. If you don't have money, how can you do all those things you're supposed to do in order to be a good Muslim? If you have nothing, how can you be Wahhabiyya? That's why I can't really say that I'm Wahhabiyya. So then I'll turn to the second aspect, which is discussing this notion of the complementarity of genders. And I'll put a lot of photos because I know a lot of you are anthropologists and you like to have something visual from the field. They don't always reflect exactly what's being said, but just to sort of spice up the talk a little bit, I'm happy to tell you more about who's in these pictures and what's going on. So on a few occasions, I naively asked these female traders whether they gave any of their earnings to their husbands. And this usually provoked very loud outbursts of laughter. And when they realized that I wasn't joking, they were all like, no, of course, like, we would never do that. They completely dismissed this idea of giving any money to their husband. So this notion that women's earnings belonged only to themselves and were theirs to dispose of was just considered completely unnegotiable. Okay. And this has also been pointed out in historical studies from West Africa, this idea that what the women earn and what they harvest in the field and so on, it belongs to them. And this of course appeared perfectly justified considering the patriarchal ideal of male providers, as well as the reality that husbands could not always be relied upon for financial support. Parallel with the notion that married women should stay at home and be provided for was another kind of ideology that stressed both the distinctness and the complementarity of gender roles. So informants would sometimes claim that married women traded in order to cover their own small needs, which they refer to as petit besoin, small needs, small. And this included, the small needs included giving presents to their children, sending remittances to their parents in Mali, or buying small luxuries for themselves, or a nice outfit or something to make themselves pretty, or something like that. One of my informants, which is in fact the woman on this picture, told me, we, the women of Mali, we don't like to ask our husbands to give us money. We prefer to look for money ourselves. To do like that, and she opened her palm like a beggar, with your husband is no good. So that's a kind of a slightly different discourse, I'd say, from the one I just described before. So these Malian women were supposedly trading not in pursuit of individual autonomy and wealth, but to contribute to the well-being and the social status of their families, and to partly relieve the financial burden on their husbands. So earning money for themselves was construed as an altruistic act by these Malian female traders to the benefit of their families, including their husbands. And yet these so-called small needs that these traders were providing for were not necessarily as insignificant as the term suggests. But by referring to their needs as small, these women discursively construed their income and their economic activities as insignificant and non-threatening to the overall power balance within the household and of course within society at large as well. So trading to cover their small needs complemented rather than contravened their domestic, reproductive and care work. But being a married trader, female trader pursuing small needs required maintaining a really delicate balance of power and complementarity of work with one's spouse. So on the one hand, women of course could not always rely on the income of their husbands, and trading was a form of insurance against that risk. But on the other hand, if women appeared to be relatively self-sufficient financially, it might create an incentive for their husbands to shirk their obligations as providers to the families and to decrease their financial support. So this was a really delicate balance that these women had to somehow try and maintain with their husbands. And one trader, Fatim, complained to me, my husband doesn't do anything. I'm the one who pays everything at home. If I ask my husband for money, he'll say, you have your own money. And a few months later, she actually told me that she had separated from her husband. So this balance was obviously not very easy to maintain in this particular marriage. But not just considering marriages, but also considering the marketplace itself, I think it's interesting to look at this notion of complementarity between the genders. So the ideal of men and women having complementary economic roles rather than being in competition with each other was actually difficult to uphold at these Malian markets. So in the past, women had dominated the trade in certain commodities, including this lucrative Bazan cloth trade, and also the trade in certain aphrodisiacs, which was also a very profitable business, but this was no longer the case. I mean, the markets that I observed in 2013, there was basically no gender distinctions in terms of trade activities. Pretty much anybody could do anything, and the markets were mixed in terms of men and women sitting next to each other as well. So I talked to Isa, who was an experienced and successful cloth trader who had been at this market for several decades. And she told me that she wanted the women at her market to unite against a growing group of young men who were referred to as coxeurs. So a coxeur is basically somebody who brings you to the goods that you're looking for. So they could guide potential customers and also foreign traders around Dakar to the markets and the shops and the places where they could find the goods that they were looking for. And often they would also broker deals on these people's behalf. And there were in fact some of the market traders who paid coxeurs a monthly salary to go and search for customers for them. This was particularly the case in this market where Isa worked, because that market was not visible from the pavement, so it was kind of hidden behind a huge commercial billboard, and you had to go up some steps and so on. So to get more customers, people would send these coxers out to sort of attract more people. But the coxers had additional ways of earning money. So when brokering a deal, they could artificially increase the price when they informed the customer of how much an item cost, and then pocket the difference between what they told the customer and how much they actually paid to the seller. And this, of course, involved lying to the customer, which was deemed immoral by many of the traders I spoke to, and it was also deemed in breach of Islamic principles of trade. And some of these female cloth traders were very strongly opposed to the practice of these coxers, who appeared to have sort of inundated this cloth bazaar where they were working. And all the coxers were men, I have to say. So Isa, for example, complained, "The coxer, he does nothing. He only takes the profit. We, the Malian women, we wanted to set up an association. We wanted to change that, but we can't do anything. It's the people in high positions who can do something about it." So a trader, and this is perhaps more sort of going a little bit into economic anthropology, but a trader like Isa, who had a permanent stall in the market, depended on cooperative behavior in relations with clients and customers. So developing a loyal customer base and relations with cooperative suppliers helped to ensure her the kind of regular income which was necessary to cover the overhead expenses for running their businesses. And of course, a coxer didn't have overhead expenses. Didn't have to pay electricity or stall rent or any of those kind of things. So to ensure that kind of regular income, Isa had to make sure that she was in good standing with all the people she was dealing with. Whereas the coxer, by contrast, did not depend to the same extent on cooperation and the development of long-term relationships with the people he was dealing with. The coxer had little to lose by inflating the price and scoring a significant profit from a one-off sale, even, of course, if that meant cheating both the seller and the buyer. So you might wonder, why don't the women either try and circumvent these coxers or become coxers themselves? I mean, one of the explanations is that it was deemed really inappropriate behavior for a woman to roam around the streets and to chat up to strangers, and that was, of course, really essential if you wanted to work as a coxer. So women were not considered capable of embodying the coxer's aggressive demeanor, and respectable women were expected to display a more dignified kind of behavior. So the coxers could be quite sort of aggressive and shouting and pulling people and running after them, and that was not deemed appropriate for a woman. So in order not to compromise her reputation and to maintain her status, a trader like Isa had to stay put in her stall and not proactively go out and look for customers for herself. So there was this sort of antagonism between these female stall owners and those male coxers, but at the same time there was another more kind of pitiful aspect of this coxer profession, which had not only emerged in response to sort of market forces of demand and supply. So the coxer phenomenon also appeared to be the product of economic crisis and unemployment, which I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. High unemployment levels or just lack of income for men. And of course, adding a middleman into the equation of trading was then a form of job creation, even if that extra link in the supply chain actually further inflated prices for local customers. So employing coxers sometimes reflected a moral decision on the part of traders rather than any rational economic calculation of profit. And I spoke to one Malian man who was a wholesale trader in fruit and vegetables that he imported from Mali, who explained to me, well, when the trucks come to the market with the goods, with the fruit and the vegetables, we give each of these coxers 20 to 30 sacks to sell. They're all men, they're all heads of families, so we give them the goods to sell for us. Otherwise we could easily sell them ourselves, but we know that everyone is here to look for money, so we give the goods to them. And then I'll move on to this sort of third dimension of my analysis, which focuses more on independence and individualism. So as I've pointed out a couple of times, many of these Malian women did enjoy certain aspects aspects of the trading occupation, even though this was nearly always tempered by whether they were making enough money. So traveling was valued by some of these banabanas as a positive experience and a way to learn about other places. The banabanas being these women who traveled back and forth between Malian and Senegal. They used to travel on the train, which is a whole other part of my thesis, but traveling was really integral to their profession. Trade was also valued as a way to learn about the world outside the confines of the domestic space, and this was particularly the case for married women who would otherwise perhaps felt that they were just sitting at home and not really know anything about what was going on outside. So for one of the women I knew at the market, Geneva, trade was to some extent a form of leisure and perhaps not a strictly financial necessity. She was very well looked after by her husband, in fact. Had a comfortable home, the way she described it to me, but she still fancied going to the market. That was more interesting than sitting at home in the soft furniture, she told me. And in fact, in her case, as with a few other women that I encountered, trade appeared to be a passion almost bordering on obsession. So Jennifer told me that she was always thinking about trade, even when she was supposed to be doing other things. I tried to teach her the alphabet because she was frustrated that she couldn't read, and we sat there in her stall and she was at one point said, "Oh, I'm sorry, but I'm just thinking about trade the whole time. I just can't focus on these letters that you're trying to teach me." So really passionate and slightly obsessed with the market and the dynamics and what was going on there. So the women clearly derived a measure of personal pleasure and also independence from trading. And a related aspect was the financial autonomy, which some of the women actively pursued through trade. So several of these Malian female traders appeared to be partly motivated by a desire to increase their levels of personal consumption and also to accumulate a personal capital. So even if they had initially started trading due to financial difficulties and for subsistence reasons, their motives could change over time, and if they were successful, then their ambitions might also increase. I mean, I asked one divorced trader, "Oh, if you got married, would you stop trading?" And especially if your husband had enough money to provide for you, and she just said, "No, I also want to make money. I want to have my own money." And fair enough. So interestingly, the strictly separate economic spheres of men and women and the obligation on men to provide financially actually meant that within a marriage it was possible for some female traders to be relatively well off while their husbands were poor. And it was the same woman who told me about her female friend who was a very successful trader going to Dubai and trading in gold and had bought 2 houses and had 3 cars, and her husband was poor, she said. So this was kind of an interesting, slightly paradoxical situation, I thought. So in this way, women might actually take advantage of a patriarchal arrangement, while men became the victims of a hegemonic masculine ideal which limited gender equality in marriage. So in other words, men might actually lose out in the patriarchal bargain, which minimized women's economic responsibilities and placed most of the burden of providing for the household on the shoulders of men. And these findings resemble observations that were made in a famous study from 1969 by Colette Lecour-Renmesson, where she studied the economic activities of women in Dakar. And she found that the Islamic obligation on men to provide for their family had reinforced the independence of wives in the utilization of their assets and earnings acquired through work. But her study did not go into much detail about the social consequences of these changes in the economic roles of the genders, including the impacts on interpersonal and spousal relations. While in theory, Malian women were perfectly entitled to keep their own money, in practice, women who amassed personal wealth instead of redistributing it were actually frowned upon. And such practices by women appeared to undermine male dominance and also undermine a communal ethic. And I can illustrate this with an example of one of the female traders, Hawa, who appeared to kind of have become addicted to trading to the detriment of her marriage. And one of her friends, Maimuna, told me, yeah, really gossiping actually, but Hawa doesn't have any children, so she has no expenses, but she won't give any money to her husband. She also doesn't send anything to her parents. And Hawa was making very good money selling these illegal aphrodisiacs that were imported from the Middle East, which are in high demand in Dakar for some reason. And so I asked this friend, Maimuna, what Hawa then did with her money. Oh, I don't know, she keeps them all. Her husband told her to leave the market, but she said she can't. She earns a lot of money. Her husband said to her, if you're trading, you have to show what you earn. You have to, buy something, give stuff, and spend the money. But she doesn't. Now her husband has said that he won't buy anything for her. Okay. So this is kind of one example of these fiercely independent women. And these kind of characters, sometimes I came across these women who were, very strong and really didn't fit with the sort of stereotype of a obedient wife staying at home and being provided for. I was interviewing people in a mix of French and Bamanankan, and Bamanankan is the official language in Mali, which most of my informants spoke and understood. And in Bamanankan there were at least two concepts that my informants recurrently used to designate these kind of fiercely independent women, and one was Musu Waraba and the other is Musu Nangaraba. So Musu just means woman, and I'll just explain what these concepts refer to. So Musu Waraba literally means lion woman, and lion woman referred to an extremely powerful woman who had supreme authority within a household, where everybody, including her husband, obeyed her commands. And she used powerful amulets, known as grigri, to secure this kind of power. And her authority appeared to be confined to the domestic sphere. So even though she might reverse power relations within the house, her aim was not to destroy the family or to pit people against each other. Whereas the Nangaraba was a slightly different kind of character, so it meant very different things to different informants. And in fact, one Malian man here in London that I spoke to subsequently told me that, a Nangaraba is a tease who is trying to seduce married women's husbands. But this was not how my own informants referred or sort of understood the Nangaraba, so I'm not going to sort of use that definition here. So one Malian housewife told me that Nangaraba refers to someone who always sought out the best quality, who was not in a hurry, but she took her time to find the best things, and it was really a positive trait. It referred to someone who had a lot of money, but who didn't save up the money. She spent it on making herself beautiful. So that was sort of one kind of characterization by this housewife. For the Banabanas, these traveling traders, Nangaraba referred to a cocky and confident woman who could get away with this attitude because she was powerful, wealthy, very beautiful and charming. And the Nangaraba was not afraid to be seen as shrewd and cunning, even arrogant, because she also had many friends and admirers. So both this housewife and these Banabanas seem to characterize the manners of a Nangaraba as appealing and fascinating, albeit somewhat subversive. But in contrast, the older market trader Umu that I spoke to said the Nangaraba was a very manipulative and self-serving woman. She basically said the Nangaraba turns people against each other. She lies, she steals, she's fearless, she doesn't work, but she earns money. She's in all the houses of the neighborhood, busy gossiping and lying, and she doesn't do any good. Everyone is afraid of the Nangaraba. She's very, very bad. Even the lion woman, even the Musu Waraba, is afraid of the Musu Nangaraba because she causes trouble and is very dangerous. So it seemed that for Umu, for this older market trader, the Nangaraba threatened to destabilize social harmony and disrupt families. And this was, of course, something even the Musu Waraba feared. So basically, I would say that Nangaraba seemed to represent individualism in women. And considering my informant's competing definitions of Nangaraba, this character appeared to provoke both ambivalence, admiration, and fear. So thinking about individuality and individualism, individuality is to some extent recognized as a dynamic force in Mande cosmology, and this is something that Bird and Kendall have written about. And this is expressed in the concept of fadenya, which literally means father-childness, and there's an equivalent term in the Senegalese wolof, I don't know exactly what it is. But fadenya, or father-childness, is associated with the centrifugal forces of social disequilibrium. So things like envy, jealousy, competition, and self-promotion. So the person who displays fadenya behavior is not bound by social commitments or obligations, nor impeded by social convention, and is capable of performing extraordinary and heroic acts. And in Mande cosmology, fadenya is then complemented by the forces of badenya, which is mother-childness, and which is associated with submission to authority, with stability, with cooperation, and altruism. So there's this notion of sort of strong individuality being a powerful force, dynamic force in society. Now, Alain Marie, in a study from 2007, has argued that all societies, even so-called communitarian ones, value personal individuality to some extent. Any society needs a diversity of competences and individual talents. But the problem in communitarian societies, he argues, is not individuality, but is rather individualization or individualism, we might call it. So sort of more ideological idea of putting the individual at the center. So he refers to individualization as when individuals free themselves from their obligations of solidarity and instead devote their specific skills and talents to the satisfaction of their personal desires and ambitions at the expense of others and the public interest. Okay, so that distinction between individuality and individualism in communitarian societies. But then we have other scholars focusing on supposedly individualistic societies, like Gullestad, a study from Norway, where she argued that in these supposedly individualistic societies, contrasting notions of individualism may actually be recognized. So with independence and autonomy considered a positive and egotism considered a negative form. So the problem with the Nangaraba was not so much her strong character and her individuality. In fact, it might be said that the lion woman also possessed these kinds of traits. Rather, the problem was the fact that she represented individualism, which my informants clearly perceived in contrasting ways. So the older trader, Umu, did not distinguish between positive and negative notions of individualism. She merely viewed individualism as being in direct opposition to the collective ethic. Whereas the housewife Maimuna that I referred to appeared to see in the Nangaraba a kind of fadenya. So a woman who, because she stood out from the crowd, attracted admiration and recognition. And then finally, these banabanas, the mobile traders, appeared to recognize that individualism, so the independence and autonomy embodied by the Nangaraba, could be a good thing and not merely an expression of egotism at the expense of others. So just to conclude, it's important to stress that the female traders' pursuit of autonomy and their potential subversion of social norms doesn't necessarily suggest that they were engaged in some kind of self-serving ego trip. So for many of the Malian women that I met in Dakar, the failures of their marriage and the wider breakdown of generalized reciprocity within families meant that they could anticipate less security in old age. So it wasn't obvious that anyone would be taking care of these female traders at the last stages of their lives, especially if they were divorced, if they were childless or widowed, as indeed many of these female traders were. So ideally in old age, a Malian woman could rely on her daughters-in-law to support her and to take over her domestic duties. But nowadays, I was told older women had to rely on their own daughters instead, as they could no longer expect their sons' wives to take care of them. So trade was a means for these women to adapt to these changing economic conditions, where the support from spouses, family, and wider social networks was shrinking. Thank you.